I'm honored to call now on Jeremy and Jeff, who are each going to share some memories.
Well, I've been very fortunate for most of my life to have had all of my grandparents alive, and while this is definitely a sad moment, there also is a lot of to celebrate today because it's a celebration of one's life, and I can't see any reason why this life should not be celebrated to such an extent. A house in Florida, travels all over the world, but more in particular, this event celebrates the end of an era and also celebrates the reuniting of both my grandmother and my grandfather back together, who really shouldn't spend any more time apart than they've already. So it's for that reason, there's a lot to celebrate, and I know that I would celebrate the only way that he would celebrate any occasion, and that's with a Stoli on the rocks with a slice of orange. So I will have a toast to him and celebrate his life the way that he would.
Over the last, since a week from Wednesday when my father passed, I've had a lot of time to think about all kinds of different things that went on in our lives together, and wake up in the middle of the night and send myself an email, some thought so I could look at it the next day and wouldn't forget about it. So literally, I would probably have 30, 40 emails a day that I had sent because I keep waking up and I said, I don't want to forget that. So I'm going to start with the real good memories that I had just growing up. The various real estate properties that he owned. 1220 Huron, where his office was located. Now it's an apartment building, which I told him one day, and he said, well, it's hard to believe. The Caxton building, that was the printer's building downtown. I remember talking to him about that small little water tower that used to be on the roof there, that up until when Jacobs Field opened and it was visible from Jacobs Field, it now could be used for advertising. Of course, back then, the building just had printers and there was nothing, in terms of Jacobs Field. The Hippodrome Theater, a childhood memory was going to see The Sound of Music, the movie, in that massive auditorium, not like movies that you go to today. The Howard Johnson's Motel at East 55th and the Shoreway. The Georgetown Inn. This is where I took my wife Meryl on our first out-of-town trip together, where we fell in love. When we arrived at our room there was a knock on the door within minutes when we had checked in, and it was someone coming there delivering fresh, warm towels. We were chauffeured around D.C. in a hotel limo to see the sights. It was quite a trip. It was the only time I went to the Georgetown Inn. There were strip centers at Broadview and Brook Park, others in Toledo and Lincoln, Nebraska. I remember the occasional trips my father took to go check on the properties. They were usually one-night trips. Those were the only nights he was ever alone. He was never with my mother. There were the Saturday and Sunday golf foursomes. Harold and Alan Krause, Roger Zucker, Dan Simon, Norm Halpern, Bob Broida, John Klein, Ken Lapine. He was a new member and somehow filled in. Once in a while, I filled in. There was not a lot of conversation in that group. Maybe they were just all serious about their golf games. His radio-controlled model airplanes that he built from hundreds of balsa wood pieces, gluing them together, painting everything perfectly, then going out to that field on Richmond Road, Most of the times they would crash. Most of the times I would become hysterical. He would slowly and precisely put them back together again. The model train set he built in the basement with bridges and a pond. His boat in Florida, I think the best part for him was cleaning it after we were on the boat, because he just loved to put it back to where it was spotless. His meticulous record keeping. He kept stock books where he would keep track of stocks and the dividends, and they were just precisely done. Every share, how much was paid for them. His dresser drawers, socks folded in a certain way, you know, with the top, you know, all color coordinated. Every shirt, piece of underwear, every item of clothing ironed, folded perfectly identical. It was like it was in a store. His preparation of family, individual, and family corporate tax returns. He was really an accountant, not officially, but he was. To this day, he still prepares the tax return for the Ruth and Elmer Babin Foundation. In the last few years, he would send it to me to review. There was never an error. And it's a complicated return when you prepare a foundation return. When arriving in Florida last week, the day he died, I saw on his desk his current worksheet for preparing the current year return. He always used that green lined accounting paper, and it was filled monthly with the activity, all with a number 2 pencil, hardly where you could read it because he could hardly write anymore. It was left right on his desk because he knew that's where I'd find it, where I needed to find it. He used to do volunteer tax work for ARP down in Florida. Remember him telling me this story when this woman came in. She was probably cute. She had a cleaning business, and she came in there with all kinds of expenses. Jim, you'll love this story. He said to her, you know, maybe you don't want to claim all these expenses, because if you show some income, you'll actually get money back, because the government has this crazy earned income credit. But you have to make money for them to give you money back. She probably felt she got her money's worth that day. The Commerce Club, where he had lunch every single day at the circle table with his contemporaries like Roger Zucker. The other circle table had his father and his contemporaries. I don't remember any alcohol being served at his table, but that I don't think was the case at the other table. I remember one particular day at the Commerce Club when I came. I was invited, and they honored an individual named Richie Stoddard. He was the first All-American at the University of Houston, and he was the son of a member. His picture-taking skills, all the trips that he puts into albums, just perfectly, and the ones that I will always cherish was when he put together a collage of some of my golf tournaments with the scorecard, pictures, excerpts from the Oakwood Bulletin. His cars that he had over the years, Buick Riviera, Chrysler Cordoba, his cars looked like new after 3 or 4 years, and he would end up trading them in for another car, but they looked brand new. Going to the Browns games in the early 60s, like so many of my contemporaries with their fathers. An occasional OSU game. He still has season tickets in his name. We're trying to figure out how we can keep those. And even seeing the Cincinnati Royals play in the old Cleveland Arena before the Cleveland Cavaliers came into existence. Florida chores. When I would come down, he'd have a list of chores for me to do, replacing light bulbs, air filters, making sure the golf cart always had enough water, distilled water in the battery, painting the baseboards, because when he would move around with his wheelchair, he would nick the baseboards. So I would always have to get down on the floor there and with a little tiny paintbrush and just try to touch them up. Then there's golf moments. He didn't really like competitive golf beyond playing in events like Derby Day with my mom. But I do remember a day when he played John Klein in the Oakwood First Flight, and it was the semifinals. He lost on the 16th hole because he couldn't get his ball from just short of the green onto the green. He kind of flubbed a few chips and said, okay, done. I know he really never wanted to win that match. I was talking to John Hipschman last week, and I think he beat John Hipschman in the match before that. John still remembers the match, and I'm sure John played probably the worst golf he played in his entire life to lose that match. But the one golf memory that stands above all the rest was a Cleveland District father-son tournament. I think I was about 16 years old, and I told my dad, you don't really need to worry. I'm going to carry the team. We'll be okay. Just, make some bogeys and, shoot, 88, whatever you normally shoot, because he pretty much shot the same score every time he played. Well, turned out I played awful. And my father shot his all-time low, 72. I remember his last shot on the par 3 ninth hole, which is back then was the 18th hole. He got up there with a 4-iron. He just rifled this shot, and he let out one of those, those sounds. When you don't hear it too often from him, but it's when you actually you hit that ball like you couldn't hit it any better. My father was there when I made one of the life-altering decisions back in 1983. I was about to sign a deal to purchase an accounting practice. It was a big financial commitment, and it could not have happened if my father didn't sign a guarantee. Well, what more do I need to say? So now we get into the part of the life, for him where my memories, obviously because of his illness, they're not the same of those memories, but they're still something I'll never forget. He had a rare disease. It was called inclusion body myositis, as his healthcare workers refer to it, IBM. There's no cure. Thinking back, the first signs were all of a sudden he would collapse out of nowhere. The first incident was it was probably 10 to 15 years ago, where he just fell down. The disease progressed slowly, eventually affecting every muscle in his body. In the beginning, he would go for infusions of gamma globulin. This was done once a month and take a few hours. This started when they still came back to Cleveland for the summers, which was over 5 years ago. He would always ask, what's the point of this? It wasn't going to cure him, but it also wasn't going to hurt him. And maybe it would slow down the progression. And most importantly, Medicare paid for it. My mother died in July 2014. He stopped the infusions in January 2015. He was still trying to eat unsuccessfully, but was losing weight and becoming weaker and weaker and falling a lot. He could not swallow and would always be choking. He finally agreed to a feeding tube in June of 2015. This was something my mother always said he should never do. Well, starving to death is not really a good option. A few months after the feeding tube, he fell and broke his leg. That would put an end to trying to even stand anymore. His required care now increased, as did his weight. After his recovery from the broken leg and his condition seemed to stabilize, at least on the outside, there would be no more falling. He was now well nourished. He was receiving the best care anyone could have. His daily routine never varied. This is what kept him stable. Any small change would be devastating to him. Basically, his routine: wake up about 9 a.m., at the kitchen table, Fox News. I hate to refer to it as feeding number one, but that's really what it was. He'd read the Palm Beach Post, the Wall Street Journal, and play Sudoku. 10 a.m., he goes into the bathroom, showers. He was very proud of his hygiene. It was very important to him. Clothing, of course, was always perfectly cleaned, ironed, and folded. He used certain body lotions and facial wash products. It turns out that I use the same things today. If they're good enough for him, they're definitely good enough for me. After bathing, he'd be put in a different bed, a little more where he could be, sit up a little bit, read on his Kindle. He read hundreds of books on his Kindle. He read all of the Bill O'Reilly books. At 12 noon sharp, back in the kitchen, second feeding, a little Fox News, to his bed for his afternoon nap, woken up maybe at 3 o'clock for another feeding. Eventually, this was eliminated. At 4:30, wakes up from his nap, taken to his desk, review his financial affairs, bills, read emails until 5:30, when he'd be taken to his den chair, receive his mail and his 3 daily phone calls. Roger, Zucker, Kathy, and me. Roger, I know you would have wanted to be here. I talked to you a few times. You were truly his best friend, and your calls were so important to him. Another feeding at 6 p.m. sharp. By the way, dinner at our house growing up was always at 6 p.m. Then watch the local news, the NBC National News, and then Fox until Bill O'Reilly would come on. After O'Reilly, back to the kitchen for another feeding. Eventually that was eliminated, and once O'Reilly was off the air, he went to bed earlier every day. By the way, my son Jeremy would call him, as you know, every Sunday around 5:30. This was another part of the routine. I know he looked forward to those calls. And it reminded me of when I routinely visited my grandfather, Elmer, and took him McDonald's to lunch at his apartment in the last days of his life when he could no longer go out. In the last few months, he was getting up later, going to bed earlier, and he would say to me he was always disappointed when he'd wake up in the morning. He lived the ultimate conflict. He really did want to die, but his care was so good he couldn't. He only went out of the house for haircuts every 6 weeks. Still need to call that the barber, because I'm sure he's wondering. The dentist appointment twice a year, annual vision checkup, all the routine, he kept doing the care that was the normal care. I couldn't even get him to go on a ride on the golf cart just to see the changes in the club that were going on down there, or even just to get fresh air. When I would visit, the quality time was from 5:30 until he would get ready for bed. We would be in the den together. The TV volume was just so high you couldn't hear anything. I was sitting near the TV. All of a sudden, out of the blue, he'd say something. Ask a question about my children, how Meryl was doing, our new puppy, recently something about the new tax laws. It showed me that he wasn't really paying attention to the TV, but just thinking about all kinds of stuff. I knew deep down he really was depressed. I think the only other person he would share his true feelings was with a vet. I would respond, "Dad, you got a bad deal." There was nothing else to say. On a rare occasion, when he would get a call from one of his friends, he would talk in such a way you would never know there was anything wrong. His dry sense of humor would come out. "Jeremy, I know when you would call, you would say he sounded okay, but he was really putting up a front." In the past few months, I would take more and more pictures with my cell phone and send them to him. It could be of our puppy, what it looked like after a snowfall, the temperature gauge in my car showing how cold it was, or pictures from my daughter's a recent wedding. And when I call, he'd always bring up the pictures I sent him. Another very sad memory is when the Jonathan's Landing Yacht Club wanted to mention my mother in their annual special outside ceremony, where they would lay flowers on a pond honoring the recent passing of one of their members or their spouses. I went to check out the location to make sure his wheelchair could have access. At the last minute, Kathy and I were down there. He decided not to go. I think it was a combination of him not wanting anyone to see him and not wanting to put himself in a situation where he might be able to not control his emotions. I never saw him cry. He wasn't even able to go to his wife's funeral. When his sister Judy and husband Jack would visit from the West Coast, he would always wear a different shirt than normal and would always, look and act like he was doing okay. He would always discuss Cleveland sports. He read the Plain Dealer online every day. He knew exactly what happened the previous day with the Indians or Cavs and Browns and all the storylines. That connection is so similar to what I have with my son Jeremy. On Sundays in the fall, he was glued to the NFL Red Zone. I think back over the last few years of his life and the things that he gave up or lost. Playing golf, driving a car, doing volunteer tax work for ARP, his Cleveland life, his walking, eating, drinking, playing bridge, writing his name, although he continued to try to do it, he could hardly hold, a pen or anything in it. And he had to have a certain kind that had kind of a tip that would write a little easier. And this is someone whose writing was always so precise in his numbering. And then, of course, he lost his wife. That was not how it was supposed to go down. He had the disease. He was supposed to be the first to go. What he didn't lose was his mind. He was still the same person throughout. He was very in charge of his own situation, directing his home care staff, when to check his oxygen level, blood pressure, medications, and whatever needed to be done around the house. He always wanted things to be in their place. I have to thank the most important people who, since my mother died, have taken care and loved my father like he was a member of their own family. I know Kathy and I consider them members of our family. This was our superstar Jamaican team. We're so grateful that all 6 of you are here today. Yvette, Rochelle, who's Yvette's daughter. We didn't actually know that right away. Carol H., who we refer to as Man Carol. The other Carol, recently engaged. Jody, and Chris, who recently married Rochelle. Also, Audrine, who was mentioned by the rabbi, who was there in the first few years before she had a baby. She had to endure making my father's bed 4 times before she got it right. It's a tribute to you, Dad, that they are all here with us to honor you today, as well as Kathy and I have 6 first cousins, and they're all here today. It's the first time I think we've ever all been together. If I could make one request, if any of you have the opportunity to go up to any of his caregivers, besides telling them how sorry you are for their loss, if you gave them a hug, maybe you would absorb some of their love and kindness, because they have so much to give. Yvette, you are an angel from heaven, one of the most loving individuals I've ever met. You made a promise to my mom when she was near death. You would take care of her Tony. That allowed my mother to die in peace. You fulfilled your promise. It didn't matter what else was going on in your life. When you lost your dad, you were always there for him, always figured out what needed to get done, and made it run as smoothly as it possibly could. You even took him to your house when he had to evacuate for Hurricane Irma. And you even brought him back home to Cleveland to be with us. My father gave me 2 pieces of advice that I'll always remember that helped me become who I am today. No, it wasn't tips on putting and chipping. The first was when I was around 14 years old. I remember sitting in the den with him and my mother when he told me, "Don't expect to come into the family business." I think he was telling me that he didn't want me to do what he ended up doing. I think the opposite occurred for him. His father told him he had to come into the business. His father, Elmer, was a very successful businessman, real estate attorney, and negotiator, and probably did not take no for an answer. He was far from perfect, but who is? And I know that working with his father was very difficult for him. as he was not always treated with respect. Even though he had a very comfortable life, I'm not sure he was really truly happy inside. My sister sent me an article just the other day about the Hippodrome Theater. It was actually a tax court decision regarding the treatment of funds that my grandfather had raised to help purchase the purchase of an existing shareholder's interest. As I read the article, it referred to how my grandfather negotiated acquiring a 50% ownership in the corporation for $250 after he arranged from his group the financing of buying out the shareholder that wanted to be, purchased out. A few people, who many will recognize their names, were part of this deal. Eva and Irv Hexter, Harold Fellinger, Sidney Fink, Maury Bernstein, Joe Babin, and Charlie Fox. His sister Judy recalled yesterday the look on my grandfather's eyes when he was upset. Perhaps someone didn't agree with him. I saw even today how Judy reacted to the cold and paralyzing look, like it was yesterday. Think of what it must have been like to work with that every single day. When the rabbi asked me some of my thoughts and memories growing up with my dad, I talked about the many things, but mentioned that I always felt my dad never had a good feeling about his accomplishments in life. After I purchased my accounting practice in 1983, I told the rabbi in 30 plus years, my father had never been to my office. The same was true for my mother. I know probably some people might be surprised by that. I'm going to take some of the blame for this, Rabbi. I know as I was working those 13-hour days in tax season and taking on this challenging task, I couldn't help but think how easy my father had it. I recalled his routine on most days going downtown to his office at 1220 Huron, arriving at 9:30, reading the Wall Street Journal and meticulously updating some of his personal records. At 11:45, he would head over to the Commerce Club with Roger Zucker. There, at the round table, he would listen to the others talk about their work and accomplishments. They were very successful businessmen. If my father would speak, he probably would have to include his father in the sentence of what he was doing or what deal was being worked on. After lunch, off to Oakwood by 2 to play 9 holes or practice or just to kill some time. I recall he was probably around 50 when they started spending time in Florida. In the beginning, my mother and him would come home for 1 week in February so my father could take care of his business. I bring all this up because I think in some way I was disrespecting my father and not involving him more. But then I'm not sure it mattered to him. I always felt he had a stress-free life and in fact could not handle any stress. In the last 4 years, we really did reconnect. For whatever easy life my father had in the last 10 years, especially the last 4, the scales have definitely tipped the other way. I could not have more respect and admiration for his bravery. How fitting it was for him to receive this military honor today. He now has something to show that even his father didn't have. The second invaluable piece of advice he told me was to go into accounting, and I knew that was something he always wanted to do. I know everyone who knew my father and came in contact with him would say he was an honest person of high integrity, a good sense of humor, and they really liked him. During his final years, I found my conversations with him would last longer and longer. I guess that's because we had so much in common and how similar we were. This past week, when my sister and I were at his bedside, watching him struggle, trying to breathe with death near, a vet said, he can still hear what you're saying. The only words that I said were, Dad, you made me what I am today. Dad, you finally got your wish. Your suffering is finally over. Mom has been waiting for you much longer than she ever expected, and your spirit will always be part of me.